Very good. Amen. Thank you, Ken. And good to be with you men. I'm Mike Haynes, director of the association in Springfield, and family roots are in Oklahoma, but my wife and I have been here in Southwest Missouri almost 20 years. She works for the Missouri Baptist Children's Home, and has she really opened up the office in Southwest Missouri just nearly about 19 years ago now. And prior to that, I pastored in the Kansas City area for a little over 20 years. So, but I just a brief kind of intro history. I struggled, I think as we all do, as a young pastor and busy children with managing time, and got very frustrated. And probably just about 30 years ago, came across the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I don't know if you've heard of it, probably have, and maybe read the book. Started off with just a book. Stephen Covey was a professor and developed the material and put it in book form, and it began to really take off, and so a seminar was developed, and it just kind of morphed from there over the years. Several years ago, the Covey organization merged with the Franklin organization, and to form Franklin Covey. The Franklin organization was an organization that was famous for their Franklin planners, and so they were both companies did some of the same kinds of things, personal management, and how to be most effective in your life. And so they merged and again formed the Franklin Covey Company. That has been a good thing, and the company continues to grow. They consult all over the world with major corporations. And I wanted just to start off by talking, and we're going to talk about time management, but the thing I would say up front is that the time management is really not the issue. And we'll talk a lot about that as we go through the evening. But time management, when we think of time management, we typically think of how can I make the most of my time, or how can I get more stuff done in less time? Show me techniques how I can get more stuff done in less time. And we're going to talk about the fallacy of that and the problem with that kind of thinking. But I want to start off just by taking a few minutes to think about effectiveness. What is effectiveness, or in your way of thinking, in your philosophy of living, how would you define effectiveness?
You want to be effective in what you do. You want to be able to get the job done.
Okay. Very good. Get the job done in whatever process it takes. Excellent. Are you the one they were talking about a few minutes ago? Very good. That's all right. That's good. You're all busy men. I know that, and so I just appreciate your taking time to be here tonight, sharing this time together. But that's. Tell me your name again now. Aaron, that's right. Aaron, Aaron, that's right. I think effectiveness, some would say, is, being effective or good at what we do. What else? What else is, maybe somebody else has a thought or a definition of effectiveness?
Being efficient.
Okay. Now, that's a good point, Ken, but actually efficiency and effectiveness are different things. The efficiency would be, how do we get more done in less time, basically. How am I efficient? And that's important. We need to understand efficiency, and we need to be efficient. But when you think in terms of like relationships, we know that in relationships we really want to be effective and not particularly efficient. Sometimes with my wife, I will try to be efficient in our relationship. You know, honey, we got to talk about this. You know, I'm not ready to. Well, it's too bad. We got to talk about this right now. I'm in the mood. We got to talk about this. That's trying to be efficient, getting the job done, you know, and quickly as I can. Where effectiveness is realizing that really the long-term relationship is more important than me getting my way in the short term or getting something talked about or some job completed. And but we'll talk about that some more. But that's a good insight and helpful to begin to think about that difference. What else about effectiveness? Anything else?
Well, you can take it this way, because I've done a sermon this way. There's a cause and effect. What's the cause of something, and what kind of effect do you want to have in the situation that you're in? So.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah. And yes.
I would think it's kind of the progression of getting the job done. It's the next step. It's not just getting it done, but getting it done well.
Yes, that's good. And really the way Covey defines effectiveness, even to take it one more step, it's getting the job done, but then also getting it done in such a way that you can get it done the next time, and the next time, and the next time. One of the problems I think that we have in our culture is we are so driven at times, and again, pastors get caught up in this rat race, but we're so driven that we want to be effective, but we literally burn ourselves out, you know, or we wear ourselves out. And that's not true effectiveness. It's not effective if I can, you know, preach really great sermons for 10 Sundays in a row, and then I'm so worn out for the next 10 Sundays in a row, I don't have anything left in the tank. You know, that's not effective. And now from our perspective as well, quite frankly, my definition to take it a step further of effectiveness is to be and to live who God created, saved, and gifted me to be. And to live life in light of God's creation, salvation, and giftedness for me. And to do that in such a way that I can live that way every day, every week, every month, all my life. So open up your book there, and for those that came in just a little late, this is 7 Habits, and let me even fill the gap in. 7 Habits of Highly Effective People is a course that was developed many years ago out of the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, and it's a company now that's a major corporation consulting all over the world in many different ways. They produce lots of different materials. In fact, a lot of the 7 Habits materials are used in schools. I was talking with the parent of a child in a grade school in Springfield the other day, and they use the 7 Habits children's materials in some of our public schools to teach kids some of the principles that we'll talk about. And for our purposes tonight, we're not going to have time to go through all the material, but I'm going to get you started, and we're going to go through the first 3 habits as we talk about time/life management, and then that might pique your curiosity to go ahead. As Ken shared earlier, I'm certified, got my certification many years ago to teach the material so I can buy the material, and I'm going to just gift this material to you guys tonight. I was sharing with the other guys earlier, this cost me $150 to buy that set of materials, and you know, it's good stuff, or I wouldn't do that. But I feel blessed to be able to share some of it with you guys, and wanted to do that. So, and normally this is a 2 or 3 day course, depends on how you structure it. And if you were to take this Covey course, now I never charged this much when I'm doing it with pastors, or have done it in the association, or when I was a pastor in other ways. But if you were to take this course just out in which you can do, but just out in the world, like Kansas City or St. Louis or, you know, Denver, Colorado, or wherever, it would cost you about $1,500 for the 2 days. So just to put a little of that in perspective, the bad side of that is that's one reason, you know, this kind of stuff we don't see in churches too much. It's in the corporate world, and but we can still we can still take advantage of it with in other means. So yeah, open your book to the initial page that says Paradigms and Principles of Effectiveness. And before we actually get into the principles or the habits, Covey talks about paradigms and principles and our understanding of what it means to have a perspective or a viewpoint or a paradigm, and then also the underlying principles that relate to all of these habits. And actually you can see on that next page the definition of effectiveness that the material gives, and says the essence of effectiveness is that you get the results you want today in such a way that you can get even better results in the future. And so that's their definition of effectiveness, which is good, but I think it's helpful for each of us to think through what effectiveness means for us personally, and especially as pastors for us, our ministry. And one of the things that we have to be careful about in life, but also especially as pastors, is we've got a whole bunch of people around us, in our church particularly, who want to define effectiveness for us, you know. And so we have to be sure that we have in our own minds what's my definition of effectiveness for my life, so that I'm not simply at the whim of the idea or the definition that other people have for me. And then the next page, Covey says if you apply even one of the 7 habits today, you can see immediate results, but it's a lifetime adventure, a life promise, he says. And I'll preface, we can talk a lot about this, but just pause right there to say, Covey himself says that these 7 habits are just common sense organized. There's nothing mystical or mysterious about the 7 habits. In fact, as we get into the 7 habits, you'll recognize they're all from Scripture. A lot of Scripture will come to mind as we talk about each of these habits. And Covey himself says, as I said earlier, he was a professor before he became an author and then a business leader. It says that, and he's dead now, but he was a Mormon, and but he says that, and he uses lots of Scripture. In other places, you won't see, there's a spiritual element to the material that is more generalized because it's for the business community, but you can see that it's underlined with Scripture. But again, the point is that the habits are just simply common sense organized. There's not anything in here that particularly is going to be an amazing revelation to you, but the way it's put together and the way it builds on other pieces is what makes it so vital and I think effective and usable. And so turn over really to the next page there. He has a page that talks about character, the roots of effectiveness, and obviously underlying all of this is character over personality. Character are the roots, and we start with that. And in our culture today, you know, we all know that it's all about the personality. We live in the age of the deification of the personality, and that's just, you know, the reality, whether it's the football star or the movie star or the music star or, you know, dress for success or whatever it may be. And Covey talks about, and we won't be able to see much of the video pieces, I'm going to do a couple of them, but Covey talks about how many years ago he did a study on literature in Western civilization, particularly as it related to effectiveness and business and personality, those kinds of things. And he said that really in American history, over about the first 150 years, you know, from the mid-1700s up until the early 1900s, everything, all the literature that was coming out related really, had a foundation of character. It had to do with integrity and honesty and right living and healthy living and family. And then all at once, he said, in about the 1920s, he began to realize that it started changing, and it was more about personality. You know, success used to be the idea of success had to do with character, what your life was really about, but in the last many decades, it's come to be about what car you drive, how big your house is, how popular you are, and that's even accentuated today with how many followers do you have on Facebook, and on and on and on the list goes. Now on the next page is what he calls the maturity continuum, and I'll just have you turn right over to page 9, the next page from there, and this is really how the 7 habits fit together. I won't take a lot of time to explain this. Again, if this kind of piques your interest, you can go back and study it some more and even get some more information online. But what Covey says is that if we want to live effective lives, we want our lives to mean the most, then we have to first of all gain victory over the private or personal habits. If you look at habits 1, 2, 3, those are the private or kind of personal habits that are just dependent on me. I'm in control of my own life, and I've got to have control of these things in my life. And then from there, you move into what he calls the public victory, or the more relational public habits. Habit number 1, which we'll get to in just a moment, is to be proactive. And that basically means that I am responsible for my own life, and I have to take responsibility and live out my own goals and dreams for my life. And the second habit is to begin with the end in mind. In other words, I need to begin each day and each week and each year with where I want to go. What are my next steps? Personal growth, family, as well as ministry work. And then habit 3, which is the time management habit, is put first things first. In other words, if we're going to be effective, we've got to make sure that we live our priorities and not the priorities that others want to place on us. We live in a social culture, and we all, we are social beings, and so that's legitimate, but we have to be careful, and we all recognize this, but we just have to be careful and aware that there are a lot of people out there in our family, maybe in our own home, maybe in our churches, maybe in our community, who would love to run our lives for us if we would allow them to, And there's a lot of pressure to conform with what other expectations our culture would like to just simply run our lives if we would allow it to. And so we've got to learn to live out our own priorities. And then, and we're not going to have time today to move into the public habits or the public victory, but habit 4 is to think win-win. How can I think healthy in relationships and decisions that can be a win for me, as well as hopefully a win, and do everything I can to provide a win for others. Habit 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And then habit 6 is synergize. And then the 7th habit is sharpen the saw. That's the one that goes around there, sharpen the saw, the habit of personal renewal or personal growth. And again, that's how we remain effective long term. We've got to continue to grow and continue to learn and to be the best we can be, and continue to learn to be the very best we can be for the Lord. Now I've been talking quite a bit here just the first few minutes, but let me pause right there and ask any questions, any thoughts or questions. Let me even ask this question. As you think about those 7 habits, what are some scriptures that come to mind that you feel like would undergird or accentuate one of the habits?
For habit 3, I think of Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you.
Absolutely, yeah. Excellent. Very good. Yeah.
They have it too, Proverbs, see a man diligent in his business, he will stand before kings. He will not stand before rude or base men.
Yeah, that's good.
Diligent character.
Right, that's very good. Very good. Any others? Well, as I said, Go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say on the first one, it says be proactive. I thought about Peter and Jesus when he called Peter that, he says, when he's out in the boat in Luke 5:5, it says, because you say so. So, Christ told Peter, go on out.
Right.
He said, because
Yeah.
I say so, so.
Yep. Very good. Yeah, I mean, and as we go along, and you'll think there's so many scriptures. Obviously, habit 5, you think of James, listen before you speak. I mean, that's obvious. And habit 4, think win-win. There's a lot of scriptures that talk about our considering others and caring for others and being open to others' thoughts and ideas. And the Lord Jesus, boy, you can see. And the habit, the first word in each of these habits is important. Habit 4 doesn't say, for example, that we're always going to gain a win-win. We do have to make decisions sometimes where other people feel like they didn't win, but we can always think win-win. We can always be working to try to create a situation, whether again in the family with our children, or whether it would be, at work or at church. We can think win-win. Very good. Now, also, real quickly, to further explain the continuum, when we're born, and when we're early in life, we're completely dependent. So we start with dependence and in life. That's just the part of life. I mean, babies are dependent upon mom and dad. And then we move from there, if a person is developing normally and healthily, we move to independence. And we all know what it's like or a bunch of us anyway, what it's like to raise teenagers. So that's when they're struggling with that, growing into independence and claiming independence, and nothing wrong with that, but we don't want to get stuck in independence. And and one of the challenges in the American culture, really in Western culture, is we have this kind of John Wayne mentality in America that, my goodness, independence, I'm independent, that's the best. Well, we know biblically, we Christians know biblically that independence has its place, but a more mature level and a healthier level of relationship and living is in interdependence, and an understanding that I need you and you need me, and we're better together if we work interdependently. And so that's also, as you move up the continuum, you can see we start with dependence, and then we move to independence, and then finally these public habits really teach us how to effectively live interdependently. And this has powerful lessons for the church. For everybody, but I think particularly for pastors and for the church. Now, turn to page 10, and I want to look. We're going to look at a brief video where Covey's going to talk about paradigms, and basically that means our perspective, the glasses through which we view life. And what he says in this little diagram here, I say what he says, what's true, is that the paradigm is what we see. And if we want to change behavior, and again, this is for us personally in managing our lives or particularly in ministry, if we want to change behavior, the quickest and best way to change is through changing our perspective or our paradigm, is to see somebody differently. To look at a situation differently, to understand differently. So many times in the church, if you look again at the little circle, what we see or our paradigm is what we do, that's our practices, that results in, of course, what we get. And so many times in the church, when we're trying to implement change, we pastors, and I'm as guilty as anybody, we try to jump to the practice. We may have an idea, if we went to a contemporary church and had drums and guitars, boy, that would be great. And so, so we get up one Sunday and we announce, now I know none of you are would ever do such a thing as this. But we get up one Sunday and we announce, now next Sunday, we're going to change the worship style. We're going to have drums, and we're going to have a guitar, and we're going to have choruses on the screen. And then we're amazed when we have some resistance to that. Well, the problem is, we may have developed the paradigm for that shift over time, but our people haven't. And so we skip over the paradigm piece and go right to the practice, and then we get in trouble. When I was a pastor, my second pastorate was in Harrisonville, and just south of Kansas City, and the church was a young church. It was 4 years old when I went there, and had grown pretty well, but it leveled off, and they were ready for some more changes, a lot of young families, and so we implemented those changes. And I remember a couple of changes the several years I was there we implemented. We went from monthly business meeting to every other month business meeting. I couldn't get them to move to quarterly business meeting, but I did get them to move to every other month business meeting. And the church grew, and the sanctuary was pretty full, and we moved to 2 worship services. And we had a little resistance, but it wasn't just awful, but we had some resistance. But I think people seemed to accept it. Well, then, over several year period, I left the church and went to another church. And the next business meeting after I was gone, the very next business meeting, there were 2 motions. One to go back to monthly business meeting, and another to go back to 1 worship service. They voted down going back to 1 monthly business meeting. There had been enough acceptance or paradigm shift to see that was adequate for the church to conduct its business. But they did go back to 1 worship service. And what that really told me, I mean, I was disappointed. I felt like the church was taking some steps backwards. But what that told me was that they acquiesced to my desire to go to 2 worship services, but they hadn't really shifted their paradigm to see that being necessary to reach more people and have a more effective, broader ministry. And they just didn't have that paradigm. I did, and some people in the church did, but the majority of the church did not. And so let's look at, Covey's going to talk just a little bit here. I want you to see him as he teaches on paradigms. What's a paradigm shift maybe one of you have had? Can you think of a time when you maybe saw something a certain way and then had a paradigm shift? I think we all have a paradigm shift once we're married. You have a paradigm shift? That's good. And then we all have another paradigm shift, major paradigm shift, when we have our first baby.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true.
What other paradigm shifts maybe have you experienced?
I went from doing ministry in the inner city to doing ministry in a rural community.
Okay.
Completely different world.
Yep.
Yep. It really was a different experience. It took me a while to get myself adjusted.
Yeah, absolutely. You had to shift some paradigms to fit the new environment. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Yeah. And even taking that a step further, if we're going to be effective long-term in ministry, we've got to continually be changing our paradigm, because our world is changing, our people are changing, obviously technology is changing. There's so many different kinds of attitudes and all that change. In fact, many of you probably know he's retired a few years ago, but Hosey Ballou at Ridgecrest Baptist Church in my association, Hosey used to say that, people would say, Hosey, how did you, grow this church from 30 to 2,000 plus, over your 30 plus years there? And he would readily say, for me to stay effective, I had to become a completely different pastor every 5 years, because there were so many different dynamics expectations and needs for a growing church and a growing staff. But that's true for all of us, whatever our situation is. Our family changes, our world changes, and so our paradigms have to continually be shifting. And one of the things that Covey talks about, and we'll get to that in just a minute, is that means we have to be very self-aware. We have to study ourselves and think about who we are, and be self-aware, so we can say to ourselves, you know, we might even say to ourselves, you know, I don't like pastoring in the rural setting. I like it a lot better in the city, so I better try to go back and pastor a church in the city. Or to say, again, now that I'm in the rural area, it's a different kind of ministry. If I'm going to be effective here, I've got to learn how to relate to these people. I've got to get into their culture and their way of thinking. So we have to be self-aware to do that. Any other thoughts on paradigms?
I was just thinking about my mom. When I was a kid, she'd get home from work and she was tired and we hadn't done one thing she wanted us to do. She'd get mad and tear into us, and we didn't really understand it. And like you said, when you have kids and you get home and you're tired and haven't done one thing you asked them to, you get a whole different look at the way mom reacts.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely. Yeah,
That's right.
that's exactly.
Vantage point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Exactly. Yeah.
I think in our application as pastors, I think we've got to figure out how our church views itself as well. Because there's a group think, there's kind of a group paradigm as, you know, sometimes there's a negativity.
Right.
We can't win. We can't go any further than we've gone, and the pastor can drag them along, and then at some point it stops.
Yeah.
And you've got to figure out, a good pastor, a good leader's got to figure out, okay, how do we retool this, and how can I get back communicating to these people again? How can I help them change their mindset from we're all losers, we're kicking the dirt, you know, like we just lost the game.
Yep.
And how can we move that forward? And I think that also is a major paradigm shift for us as leaders of groups of people.
Yeah.
And that's a major thing.
Absolutely. That's perfect, Tim. Yeah. So very true. And of course, in Springfield, we don't have quite the level of inner city that a St. Louis or a Kansas City does, but I've got a number of churches in downtown Springfield that have declined. And again, their paradigm of themselves is defeated. You know, we just survive, and pastors come in, bless their hearts, and they try to pick them up and try to get them going, and just get beaten down, and it's tough.
You have the churches that are stuck in the paradigm of the 50s and 60s.
Right.
And that's another paradigm of just cultural paradigm that they just didn't move forward.
Yes.
For whatever safety reason there was, and you've got that whole thing to fight with as well.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
difficult.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's good.
Yeah, very good. You bet. Well, if you look at the next page there, page 12, if you have time to go back and maybe work through some of this material more thoroughly, that gives you kind of a little outline to write down your own experience with a paradigm shift. You know, what were the event circumstances? What did you learn? That is, what did you see, and so forth. Very, very good. Now, as we kind of finish up this introductory part, on the next page, he talks about principles. And principles are timeless, universal, self-evident, and in operation whether we accept them or not. And each of the habits, each of these 7 habits, be proactive, begin with the end in mind, put first things first, think win-win, seek first to understand, then to be understood, synergize and sharpen the saw. Each of them are based on eternal principles. And a principle, again, is not bound by culture, by time. It's like a principle in this regard is a life principle, or a way to live that is in this regard is as universal as gravity is, to physics and science. We understand, it's easy to understand the principle of gravity. Gravity doesn't change from culture to culture, country to country, nor does it change from generation to generation. It's universal, it's timeless. Gravity is a principle of physics and of physical material things on the earth. And it's the same in relationships and in living with these 7 habits. It's not like this habit is effective in America but doesn't work in China, or this habit was effective 200 years ago but it's not effective today. No, these are habits, as I said, they're all biblically based, that we need to practice if we want to be effective, whatever culture, whenever we live. And so that kind of wraps up the introductory part. And so that moves us on over into the first habit, be proactive. And Covey at the bottom of the page where it says habit 1, be proactive, with the folks with umbrellas on the other page, where he says, while thumbing through a book, I came across an idea that changed my whole outlook. Between what happens to us and our response is a space. And the key to our growth and happiness is how we use that space. There's a space between what happens to us and our response to it. Now on the next page you'll see where that fits in this maturity continuum. And then on page 19 he gives some specific examples. The common paradigm is this is just the way things are and there's not much I can do about it. The highly effective paradigm, in other words, regarding be proactive, is I am free to choose and am ultimately responsible for my own happiness. The common practices are react based on moods, feeling, and circumstances, blame, accuse, and use victim language, waste time and energy on things you can't control, and pass negative patterns along, like the people we work with or our children. The highly effective practices are that we would pause and respond based upon principles and desire, use proactive language, focus on our circle of influence, what we'll come back to in a minute, and become a transition person. Now on page 20, he kind of illustrates that. You can see reactive behavior when there's a stimulus and then there's an immediate reactive response. And that's kind of our natural tendency. In fact, I would say that's our flesh. That's the way our flesh would be, is that we would just respond and react to stimulus. But proactive behavior, to be a proactive person, to practice this habit, is to understand that between stimulus and response there is the freedom to choose. We have the opportunity to choose our behavior, and we have the power within ourselves to choose our behavior. Now, think with me a minute. Can you think of some samples or examples in your life or the life of others where you've seen either the stimulus and immediate response or the proactive behavior response?
I can. This is an easy one. After I got saved, I had to do a 1.5 year worth of anger management classes because I'd lived a life for 30-some years, and then to go from being this person to being this person, I had to learn that there was behaviors that I didn't know how to get rid of.
Right.
So that's
powerful. That's good. Yeah, excellent. Yeah. And I know people, we've all known people that said, well, I just inherited a short fuse from my dad, and of course.
That's what I based it on.
Yeah.
My parents got divorced, and that was the whole key, and I blamed it on that my entire life and other things that happened. But
sure.
Yeah, but once I got into a biblical, counselor, it was just like, no, it was my own choice. I chose. Sure, there was traits there, but I just emphasized all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I see the difference between reacting and responding. Reacting is visceral, responding is thoughtful.
Yeah.
Reaction is our flesh, carnal,
Yeah.
and responsive is, for me as a Christian, allowing the Holy Spirit to take control. And I see that in when my kids were early teenagers, when, all the way up until 9 or 10, they pretty well obeyed, and I was okay. But then whenever they started in that tween years and then the early teen years, they kind of gave you the no look.
Right.
And I had visceral reactions, moods and swings and angers that I just had not felt before.
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure out what in the world that was about. And so I see that as a difference between reacting and
Yeah.
responding.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's very good. You bet. And so we have that freedom to choose. We do have that. And some people say, and like you were saying, it took you a while to do it. And one of the things that Covey talks about, which is so true, is that we all do have that space. Now, some people, because of upbringing or bad habits or various pressures in their own life, may not have much space between stimulus and response. But he says it's our responsibility, if we're going to be a proactive person, it's our responsibility to work on whatever space is there. And then as we work on whatever space that we have in there, then we'll learn to be healthier in our responses, and then we begin to live a true, healthy, proactive life. We're not just, the victim of circumstances. And in our culture, it's if you let it, it's discouraging and depressing because our culture is so reactive. And I'm kind of a political news junkie, and I have to turn it off. But I watch them all. I watch CNN and Fox, and I don't watch MSNBC too much, but I'll turn it on every now and then. I just like to hear what other people are thinking. But everybody is so reactive, And whatever you think of the president, one of the things that I have to laugh about is that one way or the other, everybody's so reactive. And of course, they're just every day, especially like on CNN, they're on pins and needles as to what's he going to tweet today, and then what's their immediate response going to be. And it just, if it, it is funny. I was going to say if it wasn't so sad, it would be funny. But that's just our culture. And, one of the things I've tried to do, I was with a niece of mine a while back. She's in her mid-20s. She's a petroleum engineer, really a very effective, bright young woman. And I'm trying to understand millennials. And so I asked her, about some of these things, even like not just the president, but other cultural things like the Me Too movement that's, gained such steam, the women coming out about the abuse, which needs to come out, no question about that. But, and she had some real interesting response in trying to help me understand millennials' perspectives. But again, there's just so much, the point is there's just so much of a reactive mentality in our culture today. And but we as believers clearly have a biblical mandate to be thoughtful, to respond as the Spirit would have us respond, to be Christian in our response, and to not let stimulus drive us, to not be the victim, the slave of the stimuli that comes into our lives, whatever it may be.
I think the passage of Scripture that comes to mind is Galatians 5:16, walk in the Spirit, and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. And I think that's kind of maybe the overarching, in my mind.
Yeah, that's absolutely, that undergirds the principle. Yeah, and if you look on the next page, it says you're being reactive when you get angry and say things you regret, you don't take accountability for your actions, you whine and complain, blame other people and things, act like a victim. You are being proactive when you remain calm, take responsibility, think before acting, focus on solutions, and take initiative to make things happen. That a person that does that is a proactive person and is practicing habit number 1. Again, on page 22, we don't have time right now, but you could later do a little bit of thinking on this. Where do my behaviors come from? From our genes, I was born this way. From my upbringing, my parents raised me this way. From the environment, I can't help it. I'm in a reactive environment. Where do we think our behaviors come from? And Covey says, you are influenced by your genes and by your upbringing and by your environment, but you are not determined by them. Now there's, and again, that statement goes against a certain types of psychology, because actually Freud, for one, said that we are determined really by our upbringing. The way we were raised as a child dictates how we live as an adult. And of course, we don't believe that. That's not biblical. But there are a lot of people that believe that way. And I think a lot of people play the victim because they think, well, that's just the way it is. There's nothing I can do about it, and we know better than that. But other thoughts?
Tim mentioned, I was kind of on other basis, because the first thing, I think it's Matthew 18, where Christ, speaking of, if how can I forgive you if you can't forgive your own brother? Well, that's kind of, that's the basis of the rule, is if you're going to treat me this way, then you've opened up a can, so expect something worse to happen.
Right.
Well, Christ, it was a command that, well, if you can't forgive your brother, then how do you ever expect, and when he goes on down through there, that there's kind of a judgment that comes after the next couple of verses that, hey, this is what's going to happen. There's going to be some repercussions for the decisions you made because it was your choice.
Absolutely.
Now,
Yeah.
Sure, kind of the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but
Yeah.
Jesus also raised that bar, and he said, if you hate your brother in your heart, you've murdered me. And so he's raised that bar, and so yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. But the reality is, and Covey gets into this, we won't have time really today in our short amount of time, but Covey gets into this, which of course is biblical. But what he says is we control our actions. We are in control of our lives. That's really the basis of the 7 habits. But we are not in control of the results of what we do. In other words, if we may say, well, I'm not going to forgive this person, and in our minds we'll think that's the end of it, but that spirit is picked up by our children, and then we wonder when they get to be adults why they are so unforgiving and so hardened and bitter. So every action that we live has consequences. And we need to be aware of that. In fact, in light of that, and we sure don't have time to get into this, but a fascinating study for me personally, and I say study, I'm just kind of aware of it and look for it at times in Scripture, and haven't ever put a sermon together, but I intend to one day. And it just concerns me how little people feel responsible today for the results of their actions, and how little fear of God there is. I see people do things, and I think, do you have no fear of God? Do you have no understanding of where that kind of attitude or that kind of behavior is going to lead? And again, a lot of that comes back to a paradigm, a viewpoint of life and of God. But
What you said 5 to 10 minutes ago, use the word eternal. Well, that's what I think a lot of churches we forget to preach on is. Francis Chan done a deal with the rope. There's a little red piece on the end of it, and the rest is eternity.
Yeah.
Well, we focus so much on the little spot that we forget that even though we're going to spend eternity with Christ, we have the spot and the place in line that we're going to be judged for. Hey, but you didn't do anything I asked you to. Sure, you've done great things, but there's some eternal rewards that we're never going to receive because we didn't act the way we should have here.
sure, yeah, that's right. Now, on the next page, page 24, he begins to talk about more specifically that freedom to choose, or that space between stimulus and response. And he says to really understand how to control that and to be most effective in proactive living, we need to understand the 4 unique human endowments, as Covey explains them. Self-awareness, which I mentioned a while ago, and if you'll look down below there, self-awareness is our ability to stand apart from ourselves and examine our own thoughts, moods, and behaviors. In other words, judge ourselves, basically. Imagination, human endowment 2, our ability to visualize beyond our experience and present reality. You know, what good can come from this, or how do I need to respond that would have a positive outcome in light of this stimulus? Conscience, our ability to sense right from wrong, and independent will. In other words, our ability to act independent of external circumstances. And so to understand this freedom to choose area, we need to understand, or at least live, these human gifts, as he calls them, or human endowments, that give us the power in this stimulus, in this area between stimulus and response. And then the next page, he talks about pause before responding, and they give a situation there. Language is very important in being proactive. Reactive language is I can't, it's not my fault, I have to, we have no other choice, they won't let me, there's nothing we can do. Proactive language is I can, I'm sorry, I choose to, you know, let's look at all our options, I will get this done, there must be something we can do. I love that quote at the bottom of that page. Proactive language is the language of leadership. Yeah.
You know, really, when we look at ministry, and one of the things that intrigues me is when you go into a ministry that is experiencing a high level of success, there's a completely different feeling from that. And when you go into a ministry that's in plateau or decline, oftentimes it comes right down to this language we're talking about right here is what you're hearing. We're going to do this. We get caught saying, well, we're going to try. How many times do we say that? We're going to try. And we've already entered into our mind the thought that we might not succeed. When you go into ministries that are thriving and that are growing, the language is completely different. Plans are made, and there's an expectation there of success, even in the planning stages. And we need to catch a hold of that in our ministries and in our lives. I think it'll make a serious difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think you could take that on to say there's a language of faith and a language of doubt. And that doesn't mean that, we just think and say pie in the sky and God loves me and everything's going to be perfect. We know better than that. But I think there is that element. Now, years ago, when I first got in touch with some of this material and really was at a crisis time in my ministry, this concept here just jumped out at me and actually freed me and empowered me in some ways that I needed at that point as a young pastor. And this is the idea that proactive people focus on where they can make a difference. They focus their lives on where they can have influence. Reactive people live in what Covey calls the circle of concern, circle of influence, circle of concern. And as a young pastor, I was at a time in my church there was a lot of criticism, and I was doubting myself in certain ways and struggling in other ways, and was really worried about this person over here and this failed ministry over here, and the church finances over here, and attendance was dropping over here, and I was just fretted and worried, and in some ways the family had some financial struggles, but But and I had neglected, quite honestly, to really be focused on those areas where I could make a difference, where I could have the greatest influence. And so what Covey talks about is that, again, reactive focus, as he says on page 28. When people focus on things they cannot control, they have less time and energy to spend on things that they can influence. Consequently, their circle of influence shrinks. And what happens is, if we focus out here, our circle of influence begins to shrink, and we have less and less power, less and less control, less and less influence, and our lives are less and less effective. On the other hand, when people focus on things they can influence, they expand their knowledge and experience, and they build trustworthiness as a result of and their circle of influence grows. So what I want you to do is take just a moment, just a couple of minutes, and write in the circle of influence there on your page, what are some things that you do have influence over? People, circumstances, situations, where do you have influence, and what do you not have? What are some things you're concerned about? I mean, you may legitimately be concerned about, but in all honesty, you don't control them. So take just a minute and write that down, and we'll come back and talk about it in just a second. You know, what are some things that you wrote down in your circle of influence? A couple of you share. What are some things you wrote down? Family, absolutely, yes. Co-workers, yeah. In some regards, yes. Yeah, you wouldn't have, there might be some things that you would be concerned about you couldn't change, but maybe if you're a supervisor or a manager or something, boss, yeah, some things you can influence, absolutely. What?
I can get influence inside of my school.
Absolutely, good. You bet.
I kept the focus on personal things, my study habits, my work habits. Those are things that are in my direct influence.
Very good. Yep. Yep. Good.
Study habits.
Yep. Perfect. Now, what are some things you wrote down in the circle of concern? Government, okay. Sure. Yeah.
My foreman is a Jehovah's Witness, and he sometimes hates me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of it's good.
Yeah, very good. There's things there that you don't have any control over. You may be concerned about them, but if you get overly focused or about that, then that can dominate your thinking and keep you from spending time on those things you can influence. Perfect. Yeah. What else? We have concern about that we really don't have control over.
People and circumstances.
Yeah, certain people and certain circumstances. That's right. Yep.
I put down there the opinions of others.
Yeah. Yeah.
We may have some influence over those, but by and large, people are going to make up their own mind. We need to focus on what we can control.
Right. Yep. Good point. And in our lives too, with our theology and biblical understanding, we have to be careful. One of the things I'll say I have to be careful about, and this gets into this circle of concern, I have to be careful that I don't try to be the Holy Spirit in other people's lives. And that's a real temptation for me. I have to check myself in that regard and give the Spirit room and not take responsibility for other people's thoughts or ideas. Each one's responsible for their own. I can seek to influence it through preaching and lifestyle, modeling and those kinds of things, but ultimately every person is responsible for themselves before God. And then there's just simple things, like we concern over, we fret over, we have to be careful about the weather. We're concerned about the weather, but we don't control the weather. Ken mentioned politics or government. I read the paper every day, and there's stuff in there that just drives me up the wall, but I can't let it, or it can just kind of dominate my thinking.
There's a balance there between being current and being overly concerned.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And so, go ahead.
Sports.
Oh, yeah.
Sports is something good that Can you influence the outcome of the game? Of course not.
No, yeah. Yeah,
Cheer.
yeah.
I thought we were the 12th man. Are you breaking down my paradigm now? Hold on.
Beautiful wear a lucky shirt.
Yeah.
That's it.
And really, Ken, that's really good. And I have to be careful about that because I am such a big Sooner fan, like you're a Tiger fan. And I'll have a weekend, you know, and I'll have a weekend, and come Monday I'll think, why am I so down? And then it'll strike me, well, the Sooners lost. Well, that's stupid, you know. Get over it. That's ridiculous to get wrapped up to that point. And but I do sometimes. I'll confess. Well, there we go. Lower my expectations, huh? But yeah. But proactive people understand this, and proactive people focus their lives in this area. And this is a really good lesson in regard to self-awareness, for us to be able to step back and to think, you know, I've been sure worried about, what am I so worried about? Or why am I stressed? Or why didn't I sleep well last night? Or why am I short with the kids or my wife? To step back and say, you know what, I think I have really been focusing too much on some things out here. I need to get back to really thinking about and focusing my life and ministry on. Same with preaching. You know, that's another thing. We've all heard preachers, and we've all been guilty of preaching about stuff that's out here that really we have no control over, and but it's just something we're mad about, or, you know, something that we think needs to be addressed. When we really need to think about with our preaching, okay, how can I focus my preaching so I can really make a difference where I do have influence, where people will listen to me, and where people will take to heart what I'm saying and help them begin to grow, you know, rather than get wrapped up in preaching about things that we may be concerned about but we don't have any real control over. But,
I think by dealing with people who have been through AA or whatever, the serenity prayer.
Right.
It's really kind of the same idea. Lord, help me to
Yeah.
deal with the things I can not
That's right.
change, but the things that I can. It's kind of the whole idea there. I see
Yes.
that as well.
Yeah, that's
I never thought about that.
yeah,
It's there.
that it is exactly.
And,
Now-
and
go
your
ahead.
influence and your concern, they kind of grow. I mean, with your and contract with your children, you have great amount of influence with them when they're young.
Mm-hmm.
But when they become teenagers and when they become adults, then you still have some influence. But I found out it's when they let you
Yes,
have
that's right.
the influence
Sure.
within their
Yeah.
lives.
Yeah, at that point, they're in control. They have the power, and we have to admit that and let that go. Yeah, and again, that is if we have raised mature children. See, now the thing about going back to the dependence, independence, interdependence. Understand, there's a 180-degree difference between independence, interdependence, and codependence. Codependence is where, you know, we raise our kids to be dependent upon us, where we can continue to influence or manipulate them. But healthy families, they raise their kids to be independent and then interdependent, and want their parents' input, and we want our kids' input. And so we're not talking about codependency where I've got to have you, you know, dependent on me, and I'm going to be dependent on you. That's obviously, again, unhealthy relationship. Interdependence.
I think sometimes as a pastor in counseling, this is a good example, because you can, I have somebody I'm counseling with, and they're just bound up by things that they have no
Right.
influence over at all.
Yeah.
And it's like their influence circle is really, really tiny. It's like it's constricted. It's almost like a vein that is filled with calcium.
Yeah.
And there's hardly any blood flow that's able to go through. And if you're able to expand that, they're able to live and be free and,
Yeah.
and think.
Yeah.
I think once that influence circle gets so small, you almost can't think.
Exactly. Yeah, you're debilitated. And I think that's a part of what happens when people fall into situational but serious depression. Yeah, their world just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and to where they feel like they have no control, no reason to live. Yeah, exactly.
Makes me think of the scripture that talks about be faithful with a few things, and I'll make you ruler over many things. That we have to focus on the things we actually can control, and choose faithfulness and choose effectiveness in those areas, and then allow the Lord to expand that circle of influence as He deems fit. And so many times we want to take charge of that.
Good point. That is absolutely exactly right. Yeah, and I've heard it said, and it's so true, if we'll focus on the depth of our ministry, the Lord will focus and bless the breadth of it. But on the other hand, if we get too worried or focus too much on the breadth of our ministry, then our ministry will be debilitated and shrink. Yeah, I've seen that happen even in my own life. But yeah, that's so true. Now, the last part of this habit is becoming a transition person. And I'm not going to spend really any time on here other than what's being said is that each of us does have influence, and how can we, be a transition person for others, especially when we think about our family. None of us grew up in perfect families, so how could we take maybe the things that we were some negative things in our past or in our family's past, and make sure those aren't transferred to our children? How can we be a transition person? Now, that could be the same in a church. In other ways, I had a minister of education in my last pastor at the First Baptist Church of North Kansas City, and he had grown up in a very dysfunctional alcoholic home and was converted as a young adult and surrendered to the ministry, and had radical change in his life. And I saw when he was living in the South, living in New Orleans, but he was from St. Louis, and when he came up to this area and to Kansas City with me, he became very intentional about reconnecting with a mother that he didn't have a very good relationship with a sister that he had kind of grown estranged from. He got very intentional, and even a dad that he hadn't had any contact with for years. And I saw over several years this friend of mine literally become a transition person for his family. I think his sister came to Christ, her son, his nephew, surrendered to the ministry and went to Hannibal LaGrange. I mean, there was just a series of things that happened to see the dynamic of the difference he made in his family. And I was, of course, amazed to see that and so proud of him, but was a powerful example of this. Now, on the page 32, we won't get into this, but one of the things that Covey talks about is the best way to learn is to teach. And so there, if you're taking the 2-day course, sometimes we'll pause and let different guys or ladies teach each other what we've talked about. So that's what that is. But let's move on over into habit number 2 now. Begin with the end in mind. And this habit is the habit of personal vision, as the material says. In other words, if we are really the guide of our lives, if we are in control of our lives, and if we are a proactive person, then we need to take time to think about our life and to develop our own personal vision. What is my life to be about? Who am I, and what is my life to be about? Covey says it's incredibly easy to work harder and harder at climbing the ladder of success, only to discover that it's leaning against the wrong wall. You've heard that before. And that's so true. It's so easy to get wrapped up in just making a living, raising the kids, going through the hectic pace of life, and same in ministry, that we come to a place that sometimes and say, wait a minute, I'm spinning my wheels, or I'm not going the right direction. And so begin with the end in mind. The second habit, is the habit of personal vision, or really determining what our own vision is for our lives. And the common paradigm, that next page, is I can't predict how my life will turn out, so I just go with the flow. The highly effective paradigm is clearly defining my vision and purpose in life will make all the difference. We live in a culture that, in fact, a word that I have intentionally several years ago said, I'm going to try not ever to use that word. That's such a popular word in our culture today is the word luck. We just hear it all the time. You know, well, he was lucky, or she was lucky, or I was lucky. And a lot of times we hear it, and we know the people don't mean that. You know, like even after this, I don't remember a particular interview, but I wouldn't be surprised if after the Super Bowl, some of the Philadelphia Eagles didn't say, well, we were just lucky, you know. Well, and they know better than that. They don't mean it. But that word has just kind of weaseled its way into our culture and our thinking. And we have this sense that, you know, I'm really, you know, my life just kind of rolls along and I just sort of make the best of whatever I can. And of course, that is not an effective life. That's an extremely ineffective life. And so we need to establish the vision for our lives. And over on page 38, we need to define the outcomes before we act. We all are aware that we need to make a mental creation before we make a physical creation. Now, let me ask you, where do you work? Empire Electric. Okay. What is your job? Okay. Do you have to envision where that line's going before you start your work? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, we know that in the physical world. We understand, you don't just lay the lumber out in the yard and then start putting it together thinking a house is going to appear, We know that our wives know, and we know if we're going to fix a meal, we don't just get all the stuff out on the counter and then just start throwing stuff in and stuck it in the oven and not pay any attention to what goes where. You've got to make a mental creation. We've got to create it mentally before it can be created physically. And so we understand that very naturally with the natural or physical world, but sometimes we're slow to understand that when it comes to life. That if we really want to be most effective in life, we need to envision what our lives are about and where we want to be at the end of life and what we want, our kids and grandkids to think of us and say about us at the funeral. You've all heard that, what do you want people to say about you at your funeral? One of the things that there's a video here about what do you want people to say to you at your 80th birthday, and it shows several scenarios with kids and grandkids and others throwing birthday parties for grandma and granddad. And I think that's important to consider. And so over on page 40, Covey talks about creating and living by a personal mission statement. Now, we don't really have time tonight for you to do this, but I want to stimulate you to think about your own personal mission. And you may already have something in mind. Maybe you put something down on paper in the past, and maybe you already have in mind what that mission would be. But I would just encourage you to give thought to what is my personal mission and what is the purpose of my life and really my personal mission in life. And there's some worksheets there, people that have influenced you, and if you'll turn over to page 42, talks about self-awareness, discover yourself. I am my best when, I am my worst when, what do I really love to do at work, what do I want to do, love to do in my personal time, what do I feel like my talents and gifts are. Viktor Frankl, you all remember Viktor Frankl, he wrote the book Man's Search for Meaning. He was a philosophy professor, and his book, The Man's Search for Meaning, came out of his experience as he was a Jew and was in a concentration camp during World War II and just had horrible, horrible things happen to him. And his little book really talks about why did some people shrivel and die in the concentration camps and other people survive. And Frankl says it really had to do with their vision of life. If they had a vision of what they wanted their lives to be after they were imprisoned after Nazis, those folks, he said, had a much greater chance of living than those that just acquiesced and gave up mentally and emotionally. It's a fascinating little book. But, and then on page 44, he says, imagination. Think about, if I had unlimited time and resources, what would I choose to do? And move from there, really, to, on pages 46 and 47, he encourages us in thinking through really how to put a mission or vision statement together. Who are some key people in your lives and how did they influence you, and what are your major roles? And some of this is obvious. You're a husband, a father, a pastor, a preacher, but to think about what are my main primary roles in life. And Covey says, through some studies that have been done, that really any one person can only manage about 7 roles effectively at the same time. When you think father, husband, pastor, preacher, really the role of minister in a church is going to have 2 or 3 roles. Community person, maybe if you're studying somewhere, student, but to think about what are my primary roles, and then what are my long-term goals for those roles. That next page on page 47. And this would all be just some little practices in preparation for drafting a mission statement. And then on pages 48 and 49, he has some guidance there, guidelines there to help you in putting together a personal mission statement. And then on the next several pages, there are samples of mission statements, all kinds of different samples you can read. Has anyone, have any of you guys ever put a personal mission statement together before? You remember doing that? Have you, Tim? Do you know what your mission statement is, or you remember? Okay, well. Oh, did you? Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Somebody come in and taught all of their VPs and stuff. I had a broken leg then too.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so part of the class was sitting down making.
But mission
I was
statement.
19, I think then.
Oh, yeah. It would have changed a lot.
Quite a bit.
Changed a lot since then, I'm sure. And I've written several mission statements over the years. But this is one I put together several years that I've stayed with for a long time, and all of them kind of built on each other. But this is just my little mission statement, and my mission is I live to glorify God in who I am and what I do. And there's 4 key words in my life: being, family, grace, and kingdom. Being, the key is to be. I will be who God created, saved, and gifted me to be. Family, I will give my best to Robbie, my kids, and grandkids. Grace, I will enjoy the grace of God and share His grace with others. And kingdom, I will leverage my life to make the greatest impact for Jesus. And this last one is something that I've been fascinated about for the last several years. You all remember, oh gosh, my mind's just gone blank all at once, but the Greek mathematician, what's his name? The what? No, that was another one. No, it's really a Greek scientist. He was an inventor. What's his? My mind's gone blank. Can't remember his name now. But he said, and he invented all kinds of weapons that the Romans used in warfare, but he's one of the ones that really took the idea of the fulcrum and the lever and developed it to the next level. But he's the guy that said, if you'll give me a fulcrum and a lever and let me stand where I want to stand, I can move the world. And you remember that picture of this guy with a lever and a fulcrum and moving the world. And I've thought a lot about that, in my mission statement and in my life, how can I leverage my life? How can I place my life in the place where I can move the world that God's assigned to me to move? I'm not going to move anybody else's world, but there's a world that I've been assigned to move and influence and affect. So this thing of leverage is just has been a part of my mission statement that I've worked on and developed some. So and then so the challenge really, guys, is to stimulate you. If you'll go on through the rest of that habit 2, you come over to a mission statement page, and I just encourage you to give some thought and prayer to what is my mission. And it may be something real simple. You can see from some of these samples, some of them are just a sentence or two. When I first started with mine, I had a page full of stuff, and then over the years, you refine it, and I've done that through the years. But that's been a real help to me. And as we think about time management, and really we're talking about life management, your mission statement becomes kind of your personal constitution. It's hard to know how to manage your life or your time if you don't really understand what my life is about. And you guys are all mature enough. You have a good sense of that. And in fact, I think Covey quotes the philosopher Goethe, who said that we don't really invent our mission; we simply discover it. And so what I'm asking you to do in the writing of a mission statement is not to try to create something that's not within you, but get in touch with who I am and what God's called me to do, and that is your mission statement. And you all already have. You guys are all mature enough and experienced enough in life to have a pretty good sense of that. Now, a 19-year-old, it'd be a pretty unusual 19-year-old that had that kind of self-awareness. But that's imperative if you're to know, okay, how then am I going to, manage my life so my time is most effective? And that's why my time management class has taken this much time to get to this point. All right, so let's go into put first things first. That's habit number 3. Where are we time-wise? Yeah, we got a little bit of time left. Archimedes, that's him. Yeah, he was the Greek guy that said, give me a lever and a fulcrum and let me stand where I want to stand and I can move the world, get the right leverage. Yeah, very good. What's that? Oh, yeah, there we go. Everything's at a fingertip notice. So put first things first, habit 3 is the habit of personal management. And Covey said, and then this was said long before he said it, but he said many times, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. In other words, put first things first. If we're proactive and we have a vision for our lives, then we need to, through our priorities, make sure those priorities are what we focus on in life. And the paradigm is, on page 63, I spend time on what's most urgent. I spend time on what's most urgent. The highly effective paradigm is I spend time on what's most important. In other words, the common, with people think, I'm just running from this. And one of the problems in our culture is, what do we typically say when somebody says, well, what's going on? What is our first response is oftentimes, I'm so busy. And we take that as like that's a good thing. Well, busy doing what? We're busy doing things that matter or just busy being busy. And I'm afraid for a lot of us, even in the ministry, we have to be careful or we're just busy being busy and not really productive or effective. But the highly effective paradigm is I spend time on what's most important. Now, and there's a quote from Goethe there. Things on the next page, 64. Things which matter most must never be at the mercy of things which matter least. And so that takes us really to page 66, which is the time management matrix. And this is the basis, really, or sort of the guide, you might say, for understanding how to do effective time management. You have 4 quadrants, Covey says, in life. 4 quadrants. The quadrant of necessity, that one in the left, which is both things in your life that are important and urgent. Then you have quadrant 2, the quadrant of effectiveness, which is things that are important and not urgent. Quadrant number 3, not important and urgent. And quadrant number 4, the quadrant of waste, not important and not urgent. Now, quadrant 1 are the things which are crisis, emergency meetings, last-minute deadlines, wait till Saturday afternoon to prepare the sermon, all those kinds of things that we all deal with, pressing problems, unforeseen events, those are important and urgent. Maybe kids getting sick, important and urgent. Some of those things we have to take care of. But quite honestly, there are a lot of things that creep into quadrant 1 that we could have taken care of had we worked on them in quadrant 2. Quadrant 2 is the quadrant of effectiveness, things that are important. They are very important, but they're not that urgent. Proactive work, important goals, creative thinking, planning sermons down the road a little bit, maybe planning at least a skeleton of a sermon series, doing some leadership training so you're not doing all the hospital visitation, or training committee leaders so your trustee chair can, take care of that committee and you don't have to stay with them all the time making all the decisions. Relationship building, learning and renewal, what Covey calls true recreation, true fun and hobbies that recreate us and give us energy. Quadrant 3, the quadrant of distraction, is needless interruptions, unnecessary reports, irrelevant meetings, other people's minor issues, unimportant email. We all get a ton of that. We all get jillion unimportant emails every day. Tasks, phone calls, status posts, etc. Then quadrant 4 is just waste. Trivial work, avoidance activities, excessive relaxation, television, gaming, internet, time wasters, gossip. So the point, what's that? Yeah. So the point really is that if we're going to live a proactive life that is based on our own mission for our life, we need to learn to live primarily out of Q2 or quadrant 2. And that doesn't mean we don't have Q1 things we have to deal with. We all do. We've got Q1 things that we have to deal with, but if we find ourselves living too much in Q1, then that means we're not spending enough time in Q2. And so people say, well, how do we do that? How do I do that? I'm so busy. Well, the way you begin to learn to live more out of Q2 is to just say no to quadrant 3 and quadrant 4 things. I have to be careful, and I'll confess, I have a busy day. I get home at night, eat supper, hug the wife, eat supper, sit down in front of the TV, and I love sports, news, and I'll just start flipping channels, And sometimes I think that's okay, but if I do that too much, that's just a complete time waster. I've got books up in my room I need to read, I want to read, that would be healthy and good to read. I've got other hobbies around the house that would refill me with energy if I would go do those instead of just sitting in front of the TV flipping channels. And so I have to say, if I'm going to live an effective life and live more in Q2, I have to say no, to that kind of activity night after night, as an example, or too often. And we have to say no. We've all got people in our churches that, if we let them, would just dominate our time. And we have to learn to handle those people and say no at an appropriate time, so we can spend more time on really what we deem are the important things that we need to spend our time on. So let me pause right there and just ask, what thoughts or questions do you have about that? And if you'll look the next few pages, 68, there's some other kind of homework there, and he talks about even further how do we move out of these other quadrants into quadrant 2. And again, there are things there that in those other quadrants we're going to wind up doing, but how do we spend most of our time in quadrant 2? And then there's a really great quote by Covey on page 71. He says, if you were to ask me what single practice would do more to balance your life and increase your productivity than any other, it would be this: plan your week each week before the week begins. Now, we'll come back and talk about that in just a few moments. What I want to do now is show you another video that really puts into practice, it illustrates. Now, let's take just a few minutes as we kind of come to the end to get down to some principles or suggestions, principles I should say, some ideas, suggestions, guidance on time management. Now, the rest of Q3 here, the rest of Habit 3, he gets into some specifics, but I'm going to simplify it some, and then you can come back and look at this later. And I'll just kind of explain to you what I do, how I do my life/time management practically. I keep, and there's different ways to do this, and I've changed it some over the years, but I actually keep 2 8.5 by 11 flip, notebooks, or what do you call them anyway? On my desk. One of them is what I call my there's several different names I use as I change it, but kind of my long-term big rocks. And what I do with those, based upon my life and my ministry and my vision, and of course the strategic plan of my association, what I'll do there is I'll write, I'll have just a list of things, and it may be anything from something that's just out there further down the line. I know there's a leadership, conference. It's not several months away that I've got a plan for, and I'll have, I'm working on. I've got some inner city churches, and I need to, just connect with pastors in relationship to that. And we've got the annual meeting, of course, that's coming up in the fall, and so I've got to keep that in mind. And so I'll have, maybe a dozen or 15 long-term kinds of things that I'll keep in front of me in my long-term big rocks. And then as weeks go by, I'll make notes in the margins, and I will, prepare to move that, get some things done with that, but then prepare to move that to my short-term or my more immediate big rocks. And this, it depends, and I've changed this a lot over the years. I used to do this basically every week. Every week over the weekend, or maybe on Friday, I would sit down and make a whole new list for this. I don't do that quite as often now, but I'll try to every couple of 3 weeks make sure I start a fresh list or clean up the list, you might say. But for you guys, let's say this is going to be a one week. You're going to sit down on Friday and you're going to think about next week. What are my big rocks, my primary priorities that I have to get done? And maybe you don't need to complete them next week, but you need to work on them next week. So what are just some of those things? Sermon prep. Yeah, we'll just say sermon prep. All right. What else?
Hospital
Okay. What else comes to mind? All right. You know, we might say, you know, it might be we got to recruit VBS director and staff meeting, you know, or we might say maybe not staff meeting, but maybe we've got deacons meeting coming up, and so we've got to get ready for that. But also you want family stuff, so we'd say, you know, take wife on a date. The what?
Take her out for Valentine's.
There you go. Take your wife out for Valentine's. Well, and even related to that, you might want to write down and make sure you have on there get Valentine's card. You know, don't forget that. And
I take her out before Valentine's since it's on Sunday.
oh,
No, it's on Wednesday.
it's on Wednesday. Yeah, it's Wednesday night. So and then do something with the kids, or you know, and then you know there may even be some other family thing, like you may be thinking, you know, I need to give mom a call. Of course, it's Valentine's, so. Call my mom, you know. But then what about your own personal self? You know, what are you what are you doing for yourself? What hobby do you want to do? You know, work on whatever your hobby is, or you know, if the weather's nice, I don't know if you like to fish or whatever, but go fishing, or even just go to Bass Pro, and they're getting ready for the fishing classic coming up. So you know, anyway, just some fun stuff. And then, and you might have for a week, you know, you might even have several other things down there. Of course, again, so you guys that are bivocational, you've also got, you know, you've got some goal-specific things that you need to know that you need to do at work. Whether again, you've got obviously the work you do, but you've got, you know, order some supplies, and you know, talk with a coworker. There's a coworker you need to have a special conversation with, and maybe you put it off for a couple of weeks, and you say, "Man, I got to get that done this week." So you have all these things on your weekly to-do list, and then and this really comes from the Franklin side of the Franklin Covey kind of management. Then you come back and you prioritize these in A, B, C. A is, I got to get this done. B is, I hope to get it done. I'm pretty sure I will, but you know, I got to make sure I get the A's done. And C are, I want to get this done, but if I don't get it done, it'll be a A or a B next week. And so then you go through and you'll say, "Yep, I got to do the sermon prep, and you know, I've got this recruit the VBS director. We're still okay with that. I wouldn't have to get that done this week, but I got to take the wife out for Valentine's, or I'll pay a price for that for a long time. And I sure want to call mom, and then I've got to talk to this person at work. That's getting out of hand." And then, you know, we don't have anybody, at least at this point, in the hospital, so hopefully I'm in good shape with that. I've got to set up these couple of meetings, and deacons meeting isn't really for a couple of weeks, and so I could wait on that, but I got to start thinking about what we're going to talk at deacons meeting. And then when you get that done, then the way you do it, the way I do it, and most effective when I do that, is then come back and then actually start with the A's and say, okay, of all of these, what is the most important thing I've got to get done this week? If I don't do anything else, I've got to take my wife out for Valentine's. That's number one. And then number two is, I got to make sure I spend adequate time in preparation for Sunday. And then, you know, I've got to talk to this person at work, and then I sure want to give mom a call. I don't have to call her, you know, during the week if I could wait till the weekend, but I got to get that done. And then I need to recruit that VBS director if at all possible. If not, it's going to be an A next week. And so then you've got a time management system that really you're in control of. You've decided what my priorities are, what my big rocks are. You've decided that. You've prioritized those big rocks as to what you need to get done this week, at the end of this week. So by the end of the week, when you look back on the week, you can honestly assess, was I effective this week in accomplishing what I set out to do? Now, guys, we all know that in the ministry, a part of the ministry is living with interruptions and living with emergencies. So we may be thinking things are going along pretty good, and then we've got 3 people in the hospital in Springfield, had to run to Springfield 2 times for emergencies. We've had a key couple in our church whose marriage in trouble, and they called us up and said, "Pastor, can we come and see you?" And you spent several hours with them. And so, there has to be adjustments. We know that. But when we start our week off or our life off with a vision and priorities, it's amazing how so many things that used to get in the way become just little rocks. Not that they're totally unimportant, but they don't dominate. And so that's how we can more effectively manage our time. Now, years ago, in our systems today with the phone, and I use an iPad for my calendar, aren't as effective to me as what I used to use. I used to use the Franklin Covey Planner, daily planner, that would be set up like, let me show you here if I can. I think they've got you can see on page 73. Yeah, page 75 probably, that would be best. Yeah, 74, 75. And I would start every week off by actually writing my priorities, my roles, and then priorities over under big rocks on the left, and then go through the week and actually schedule those. Again, for bivocational guys, your schedule, a lot of your week is already set with the job that you've got, so you don't have any control over that. But you could go into your evenings and say, okay, when am I going to get my sermon preparation done this week? And if I'm going to call and try to recruit our VBS director, which night or is going to be the best to do that? Should I try to catch this person at Wednesday night prayer meeting, or maybe give them a call on Thursday? And you can write some of those things in your calendar. I used to do that. I don't do quite as much of that as I used to. I just try to pay attention every day to where I am with my big rocks. And then every week, go back and look at, the longer term big rocks, to think about, okay, do I need to move this one over here, or are there some things even on this leadership conference? This is 4 months away, but do I need to go ahead and do something in relationship to this? I may not move it over to the more immediate big rocks, the short-term big rocks, but take care of something regarding that. And so I'm moving these, of course, into the other sheet when it's appropriate, while also continuing to work on some of the longer-term details on the long-term big rocks. So that's kind of a brief overview, but the purpose is that your planning and your time management grows out of your proactive lifestyle, your vision, your mission of your own life, and is a result of your choice, and you're working on that circle of influence and not getting sidetracked by spending too much time in the circle of concern. Yeah. So, questions, thoughts?
Taking it in.
Okay.
What I found out, when you do that and you start checking them off, there's a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah.
And that's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, and it helps you then kind of measure progress, which helps. And one of the challenges in the ministry particularly is that we do struggle with what did I accomplish today, and how did I make progress in my life and in the ministry today, or did I just spin my wheels? And we all have lots of days like that. But if we have a planning system and we take some time to write things down regarding planning, it's amazing how satisfying and helpful that can be. Yeah.
I've got 4 or 5 projects going on usually, and so I just take those projects and write on Word and just write down what do I need to do and just line them out.
Yeah.
And then that a week or 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, just look at them and see where am I with these.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that helps a bunch.
Yep.
That was probably the toughest thing, because I work full-time plus preaching too, but where I preached, I'd done Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, and was the Sunday school teacher too.
Oh, wow.
So it was hard to split up, and I ended up burning out like the first year. Yeah. And then, but long story short was, the thing that probably caused me the most trouble was I put so much time into sermon prep and all those things that I left out my own quiet time and being, just isolated. There's a difference between preparing for a sermon and being in a quiet place on your own and trying to divide time. Plus, I work for the city of Aurora, I'm a wastewater on call. Never failed. You'd be visiting someone in the hospital, or you're in the middle of writing, and the phone go off, and then you're out, and then I would try to do my normal job, and then you're stuck on, I wonder where I was at when I'm going to get home. I know Ernie goes to this too, because you get back home and you're like, I was in a train of process of writing stuff out. And then you're like, then you can't sleep at night. You're awake. You sit there and toss and turn. Yeah.
Yep. I've been there many times. Yeah, but that's right.
It's hard.
Yeah.
People don't.
Well, and a part of that too is like we learn ourselves, and we get, you start dealing with the next church, and they'll say, well, Pastor, we want you to do Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night Bible study, Saturday morning men's breakfast, and then that's where you have to say, folks, I'd love to be your pastor, but here's what I know myself, here's what I can do. I'll do Sunday morning, Sunday night, I can lead a prayer meeting Wednesday night, but I'm not going to preach or teach on Wednesday night, and somebody else, I'll be at the men's prayer breakfast maybe a couple of times a month, but I can't with my busy schedule. In other words, we've got to understand some of that so we can balance that and be honest with ourselves and with the church. Yeah, that's right.
There's a difference.
Yeah.
I understood that, but they didn't see
Yeah.
it quite that way.
Yeah.
Because I can get comment, that's what we're paying you for. And I understand that,
Yeah.
I completely understand. But they didn't understand. And now that I'm not there, they do Sunday morning and that's it. And
Yeah.
then they do choir practice on Wednesday nights.
Yeah.
Thank you,
But-
Jesus.
Yeah.
The church will
Very
reach you
good.
up.
Yeah.
Yep. Very good. Anything else, guys?
It's that paradigm thing that he was talking about.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
didn't get the paradigm.
Yeah.
I watched David Jeremiah do that.
Oh,
He done a sermon about, I didn't know that that's where he pulled it. He added to it.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
really good because he ends up putting sand and water and
Yeah.
everything into there and
yeah,
stuff like
that's
that.
a way you can,
prioritizing.
yeah, you can do that. That's a good way to illustrate it, yeah. But, very good. Well, guys, it's been great I thank you, Ken, for the opportunity. I've enjoyed this very much. Ken knows how to get in touch with me if you've got any questions.